All right, we welcome Jason John to lead us this morning on ecotheology in the Old Testament.
Thanks, John. Hey, everyone. For those of you who've joined since, I'm glad to be with you from up here on the mid-north coast in Gumbaynggirr country, just near Coffs Harbour. I thought I'll share this PowerPoint with you. For it's written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain. But is it for oxen that God is concerned? Or doesn't he speak entirely for our sake? Well, of course that was written for our sake. At least that's what the Apostle Paul reckons when he's writing to the Corinthians near the birth of Christianity. So back in the 80s, there was a guy called Paul Santmeyer who's gone on to write lots of books about Christianity and the environment. And his first one was called The Ecological Promise of Christian Theology. You could probably also write a book called The Ambiguous Ecological Promise of Old Testament Scriptures and New Testament as well, because the Bible to me is this kind of voluptuous moral mess. It has some excellent bits that we love to read, and it has some really challenging passages as well. And particularly that's seen in the way it portrays the relationship between men and women, and also the relationship between humans and the rest of creation. So Lynn White, who wrote a famous or infamous paper back in the late 60s saying that Western Christianity was the most anthropocentric or the most human-centered religion the world had ever known, and that it was therefore to some extent culpable for the environmental degradation in the West, he had a reasonable amount of ammunition to draw on. We'll get back to that later. My name's Jason. This is a picture of where I live. Hopefully you can see that. We're a little, well, it's not technically a house, it's a shed, but a little dwelling in the forest on the mid-north coast. It looks pretty organized from there, but as John and Elizabeth could tell you, if you ever come and visit, it looks more like some kind of Waco Christian compound that's been cobbled together over the years and that might quite scare you if you stumbled upon it when you're out bushwalking. But anyway, we like it. So I'm just going to read you a poem and then I'll kind of unpack the poem a little bit. Blokes birthed the Bible, and men mediated its meaning for many a generation. Now, I'm not insinuating that was wrong, I'm straight out saying it. But today there's another point I'm making, because the Bible was also written by Homo sapiens, by you and me, or at least creatures with our ancestry. Sapiens wrote the scripture. Get the picture? So we have Genesis 1, how it all begun. Let us make man in our image, have dominion and subdue, through to Genesis 9, where God says to Noah, but not to his wife, now I give it all to you. Woohoo! But what's a tree-hugging Christian to do? Well, we can turn to Genesis 2, the Adam from the Adam are humans from the humus, created not to own and rule, but to serve and protect. And yet, serve is usually translated till, and that was probably their intention. This story may be very, very, very old, but it was compiled after the invention of agriculture, turning that horrible scrub to garden, swamp to paddock, filling larders, settling down, claiming titles, mine, my land, my animals, my women. Yes, blokes birthed the Bible and men mediated its meaning. Humans did the writing and humans did the reading. But because some women worked really hard and long with a few male supporters, the church finally heard their song, and especially that of their daughters. So perhaps all the other species can get a look in too, not just as pets or produce or as food or glue, but as much a part of God's story as me and you. Of course, they can't work at it hard and long, so it's going to be up to us, their supporters, to sing their song. Yeah. So even in the Uniting Church, and sorry, Elizabeth and John, I should have checked, but I'm assuming probably everyone or almost everyone here is Uniting Church members, because most of them are part of your congregation. Okay. So apologies.
I don't know about Libby. Libby's a guest today, but everyone else is Uniting Church. And
Jock also.
And Jock is not Uniting Church.
All right. Okay. Well, I'm just going to talk a tiny bit about the Uniting Church as a bit of a case study. So even in the Uniting Church, which fully accepts the ordination of women and where you can't become a minister unless you support the ordination of women, advocates for that position have had to acknowledge that the later New Testament writings reflect a steady drift towards the subordination of women. So there are some passages like Galatians and Acts, which seem to place And others like 1 Timothy, which claim that even vulnerable, getting quite a lot of internet connections slightly unstable too. Okay,
Yeah,
so
you are
in the
breaking up.
have to be subjected to continual. Yeah, quickly recap that. In the Uniting Church, we support the ordination of women, but we've accepted that there are biblical passages that seem to argue for and against women leadership in church. So we've had to accept that even ancient Christian traditions must be subjected to continual critique in the light of the gospel. And we found it vital to do that because we came to understand that unless we properly understand the relationship between men and women, we aren't going to be able to live out the gospel fully or live out our lives properly. So no, it's not enough for men to just patronizingly treat women well and look after them. We had to come to the realization that men and women are equal and understand the relationship between men and women and God properly. And so it seems to me that in a church which has managed to do that for the most part, we're well placed then to tackle Lynn White's accusation that Christianity was not only male-centered, but it's also human-centered. And to ask the question, well, what does it mean that the Bible was written by human beings and not just men, and of course reflects a human perspective? So Christianity, Christian anthropocentrism, tends to assume that humans are the center of the story of God and life. It draws on Genesis 1 and 8 in particular, assuming that humans are the image of God, we're the only ones who are the image of God, that all of creation is delivered into our hands and we are to rule over it as God rules over us. Increasingly, people have found that unsatisfactory and drawn more on Genesis 2, which positions humans as the servants and the protectors or the caretakers of this garden that God has created. And we'll come back to Genesis 1 and 2, but in Genesis 2, human beings are there to look after God's garden, but still we're very much the center of the story. And we see that in Genesis 3, where we ruin everything. So if we take the Uniting Church as a case study before we get to the Old Testament scriptures, our founding document talks about the reconciliation and renewal of the whole creation, okay, which is, you know, it's written in the 70s, it reflects its time, but there's this great vision that it's not only human beings, but all of creation are going to be caught up in God's reconciliation and renewal. But at the same time, we also say that we affirm our eagerness to uphold basic Christian values and principles like the importance of every human being and a concern for the human race. We're concerned with human rights of future generations and will urge the wise use of energy, the protection of the environment, and the replenishment of the Earth's resources for their use and enjoyment. So in other words, creation is still just stuff for human beings to use, and we're going to share it out fairly. It took another 10 years before we affirmed our belief that the natural world is God's creation, good in God's eyes and good in and of itself. But we struggle to move beyond seeing humans as the center of the story because it's kind of as unpopular as it was when Galileo said the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. The question I'm hoping we'll come back to in the discussion is, can we have a proper relationship with the Earth? Can we do enough to care for the Earth or save the environment or combat climate change if we still really think that it's all about us in the same way that men used to think it was all about them? Or do we need to properly understand our place in creation and the relationship of other creatures to God if we're going to move forward? It's one of those questions that you can already tell what I think the answer is, but I'll be interested to see where all of you get. So there is very strong biblical encouragement to do that, to see humans as not being the center of the story. And we're going to look at some Old Testament passages now about that. So Psalm 104, I went through, originally I was going to highlight in yellow as the really good bit, but it's pretty much all good from this point of view. It talks about God causing the grass to grow for the cattle, okay? God is interested in the cattle and working to sustain them. The high mountains are for the wild goats and the rocks are a refuge for the conies. In other words, this earth exists for other creatures. The young lions seek their food from God, the assumption being that God provides it. In wisdom, God has made all things and the earth is full of God's creatures. So again, these creatures don't belong to us. The earth doesn't belong to us. All creatures belong to God. And all creatures look to God to give them food in due season. So, you know, what we say about God and the Spirit sustaining the life of the church is equally applicable to other creatures. And God is in control of, the breath of all of life, who gives and takes away. Psalm 148 sees all of creation caught up in praising God together. The mountains, the hills, the fruit trees, the cedars, the wild animals, and the cattle. White, Western, repressed Anglos like me struggle to approach this passage as anything more than pure poetry, but there are many more passages in the Psalms that kind of emphasize that all of creation is praising God, and God is in intimate relationship with all of creation. Isaiah 11, this extremely famous passage that makes no sense biologically, but clearly shows that in Isaiah, the vision of the future, of the reconciliation of all things, of salvation involves all creatures. That no creature will hurt or destroy or be hurt or destroyed anymore. And the reason for that is because the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord. So when we finally understand God and what God's on about, this will bring about salvation for all creatures. And of course, that's a kind of a return to the vegetarian Garden of Eden in Genesis 1 and 2. Job 38, many more passages from Job could be quoted, but basically it makes a very strong point that humans barely understand what's going on in the world. And even though we actually can answer a number of the questions that God asks Job from the whirlwind, we've discovered many more questions since then that we can't yet fathom. So again, this sense that God is there sustaining all the creation, quite apart from its interest or use to human beings. Just want to flick over quickly to the New Testament, because the New Testament draws on this Old Testament spirituality, I think, and particularly the wisdom tradition. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, a kind of Greek way of talking about the wisdom tradition. All things came into being through Christ in John 1. In Colossians, Christ is the firstborn of all creation. All things in heaven and on earth were created by him. God has reconciled to himself all things, not just humans, making peace through the blood of his cross. And Paul talks about this sense, kind of reflecting Isaiah perhaps, of when creation will be set free from its bondage and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. So this kind of idea of salvation in the future that many Christians have of basically beaming up to heaven and leaving all of this behind to be destroyed is just not a biblical picture. We could say more about Revelation and the descent of God to live among us and so on, but we won't. So I just wanted to pick up quickly before we go back to the Old Testament on this idea in Romans. It's a really fascinating passage about the creation waiting with eager longing for the revelation of the children of God. And clearly, I think to Paul, the church was the revelation of the children of God, and he saw what was happening in his day was the beginning of the good news for all creation. And most of us, it wouldn't be controversial to call, the church the children of God, if not all of humanity. And we have been revealed, and we are here. So I guess the question is, was creation right to wait with eager longing for this revelation of the children of God? Because there doesn't seem to have been much good news for animals since the church began. And in fact, things have probably got have definitely got significantly worse. And so I guess the question, going back to that Old Testament passage, the Old Testament Psalms, seeing all creation joined in praise of the Creator who is sustaining them, how do we make sense of that vision in terms of a factory farm, for example? Okay, back to the Old Testament. I want to basically just look at the Noah story in Genesis 1 and 2. Probably take us about another 7 minutes. Are people right for me to just roll on and do that? Or Elizabeth, do you want to have a little breakout group now? I thought we'd probably roll on and then do breakout groups, but Zoom can be hard to stay tuned in.
I'm happy to do that. Is everyone happy to keep going? All right, I've muted them all, so Sorry about
And I can only see two people down the side. So
I'm
we'll roll on.
assuming that no one's unmuted themselves and gone, no, I object. So keep going, great, Jason.
Okay. All right. Okay. So the Genesis story of Noah and the flood, we're all very familiar with. And particularly it gets quoted a lot by kind of earth-loving Christians about God making a covenant with all creatures, never to wipe them off the face of the earth by flood again. As well as peace workers, this sense that God is laying his bow in the cloud, and it will be a reminder for God of the covenant that he's made with the entire earth, not just with human beings. But the whole story, like that's kind of the good bit at the end, but the whole story is a very MA 15 plus tale. And it led to some really problematic theology around the world, probably, but most recently in the Pacific Islands, where Christian leaders have struggled to shake off some of the legacy of this story, or at least the way it was presented to them by the missionaries. So I'd like to read you another little poem, and then we'll kind of unpack that a bit in Genesis 1 and 2. So this kind of explores Genesis 1, 2, and 3, focusing in on the really problematic parts of it to encourage us to have a deeper conversation, I hope. So the perfect God had a perfect plan to make a perfect world and clap it off with man, and woman. Adam from the Adamah, earthling from the earth, created to serve and protect the garden. You had just one job, man. Then God made a walking, talking snake for reasons still unclear, and a tree of death with fruits of delight. Yeah, I know, right? Oh dear. So the perfect plan went pretty wrong. No surprises there. A little bit of fratricide. Suddenly cities are popping up worldwide with a bit of polygamy for good measure. They all lived a very long time, and the women were sexy, or so the angels thought, so they made angel human babies. The Nephilim, they called them. Still nobody knows why. Then the humans all turned totally evil, so the good God had a good cry. Then he got mad and murdered them all, and to make it really hurt, he slowly filled the world with water so they all splashed around and drowned, instead of giving them embolisms in their head so they could fall down painlessly dead. But Noah lived, and his family, because he was a righteous dude, if by righteous you mean a vindictive alcoholic slaver who lay around in the nude. Yes, the first thing he did was plant a vine, then brew himself a keg of wine and pass out drunk with his willy on display. A righteous dude, hey. When his son saw him and had a giggle, he said, "You snitchy little bugger, now you'll be a slave to all your brothers." I'm not sure that Genesis's history or even sacred mystery, the one righteous man, I think they were taking the piss. Unless we see that, we might miss the point. So there's Noah, the righteous alcoholic vindictive slaver. But lucky for me and you, he could cook a mean barbecue. And thank you for that point, Elizabeth. And it smelt so good, see Genesis 8:21, that God said, okay, I won't murder everyone ever again, at least not by flood, though he went on to demand plenty of blood. Which is why until recently on islands like Fiji, they weren't worried about sea level rise because of the old missionaries and this story which promised them protection. But the storms got worse and more people got dead, so they said, we have sinned, this is all on our head. Then they thought some more, and some of their priests said, hang on, our carbon emissions are the least. Why is God taking it all out on us and not those Western industrial bastards? So they got in their canoes and they blocked Newcastle Harbour, and they paddled off to Paris and they started shouting louder, hey, all you carbon sinning scum, it's time to repent and atone for what you've done. We need a new ark because our islands are sinking, so you'd better set aside some nice room for us, we're thinking. And our Polly said, sure, you're welcome in Australia, just get in your boats and sail over here. You can have Sydney Harbour and the National Park behind it. Pack your things and we'll make room for you, you bet. At least they might. They haven't said that yet. So be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you shall rest on every animal of the earth and every bird on the air, everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hands they are delivered. Every moving thing shall be food for you, and just as I gave you the green plants, I gave you everything. It's very different to read that passage in the 21st century in an industrial nation like ours than it would have been to read it, 3,500 years ago, as an oppressed people in captivity in Babylon, barely able to hope that you would even get your own land back, let alone be able to dominate anything. So I alluded to Genesis 1 and 2, and I want to just finish by unpacking them briefly. And I want to suggest to you that these are two quite different ecotheologies represented here. There's Genesis 2 or 2:3, which is a much more ancient story. and Genesis 1, which is a newer story, which basically presents the ideas that are then picked up in the flood story. Norm Harbel was a Lutheran Old Testament scholar, and Theo Hybert, a colleague of his, really emphasized the difference between the two stories. And if you're really interested, they've got some Bible studies about that, and I can send John and Elizabeth the link. So Genesis 1, especially in the hands of modern Western Christians, this is pretty much the basis of Lynn White's accusation about Christianity being the most human-centered religion the world has ever seen. And it pretty much does back him up on that. Let us make humankind, or actually let us make man in our image, and let them have dominion over basically everything. So we had John Wesley saying that we humans are a spirit made in the image of God, an incorruptible picture of the God of glory, a spirit that is infinitely more valuable than the whole earth. Which kind of starts out sounding good. It's very affirming of human beings, but then to place a single human soul as more valuable than the entire earth pretty much feeds into that human-centered claim. From the Catholic tradition, with man, we find ourselves facing a different ontological order, an ontological leap, we could say. Man, sick, is the only creature on earth that God wanted for its own sake, said Pope John Paul II, completely ignoring all of those Old Testament Psalms we read before. So the main point in Genesis 1 is that humans or men are placed over all other animals to rule over them. And in Genesis 1, this is part of the plan. Okay, that's God's idea from the very beginning. Let us make humankind in our image and let them have dominion. We're told to subdue, to tread down, to enslave the earth and rule over it, and everything is delivered into our hands. A lot of effort's been spent trying to show that dominion and subduing aren't as bad as they sound. And again, I can send John and Elizabeth a one-pager for anyone that's interested in looking at that more. But basically, I think it's a fruitless task to try and make those words seem softer. Dominion, the Hebrew word, kind of comes from the idea of treading down like feet in a wine press, subduing, subjugating, scraping out. The actual word subdue, or kabash, means to bring into bondage, to make subservient, to violate or assault. In the rest of the scriptures, it's used in the context of war and defeating our foes. So this really is about giving humans the opportunity to defeat creation and rule over it. And again, that's picked up in Genesis 9. And we can't really escape it by saying, well, we're to rule as God rules, and God's rule is nice and therefore ours should be, because we've just seen God decide to flood the entire earth and kill everything on the planet. So if we're taking God's rulership of the earth as a model, at least as it's expressed in Genesis 9, it's not much better. But Genesis 1 also has great value if we remember the context, because most people agree that this was actually this was put together by the priests while they were in captivity in Babylon, having just been absolutely smashed and subdued themselves and are dragged away into captivity. They're surrounded by this massive culture with its new religion, and they're trying to keep their own culture alive while they're in bondage to other people. So it's not even really talking about human beings and the rest of creation. Mark Brett argues, and I think he's right, that this is all about social justice. So the Babylonians had already claimed that their king was the image of God, and their king had dominion over all of the lands and all of the people. Okay. So this story is saying, no, that's not true. It's actually all human beings which are in the image of God, and all human beings have the right to sustain themselves from the land around them. So it's all about social justice and not about ecology at all, because ecology wasn't even an issue yet. So Genesis 1 is written by an oppressed, landless, and captured people trying to hold on to some hope and undermine their oppressor's theology, which makes it really tricky when it's read by modern Westerners like me, whose ancestors came to this land and dominated it and put other people into bondage and are benefiting from the system. So this is the kind of wealth distribution of the world. We can see it's got worse since COVID, by the way. The richest 20% of the people own 80% of the income, and the richest 1% own half of the world's income. So Genesis 1 has some really strong things to say about that and how unacceptable it is. Genesis 2, the old creation story, kind of meant to. It's got a really different flavor and style, even apart from kind of the different words that are used. I find when I read it, it has this kind of quaint and very earthy sense. To me, it reads like a Hebrew dreaming story. You can imagine telling it around a campfire with some dirt on the ground that you use to mold the animals and the humans, and kind of acting out the play of all the animals being brought to the earthling to name them and so on. It works great with kids if you tell this story outdoors. And in this version, God plants a lovely garden. He makes an earth creature to look after it. He doesn't give the garden to the earth creature. He makes some animal friends to keep them company, and then a partner, and then God wanders around with them in the cool of the evening, enjoying the garden. So it's like a hippie commune, really, around Bellingen, at least the ones that are still surviving. There's this great, strong sense of connection. The Adam is created from the Adamah, the Hebrew word for earth. So it's the earthling from the earth. Yanach, God took the Adam and Yanach him in the Garden of Eden, which means to rest. So God rested the earth creature in the garden to look after it. Abad and Shema, to serve it and to guard and protect it. We almost always translate that till and keep, but the root words are serve and protect. So God takes the earth creature, rests it quietly in the garden to serve and protect it, and they're naked and unashamed. It's hard to imagine a kind of better image of life than the one in Genesis 2. And we could imagine how differently, I don't know, possibly how differently Australian history, if it's just one example, might have gone if we had translated it as to serve and protect the garden. Because when Australians arrived, when the English arrived in Australia and looked around, nobody was tilling the soil, at least as far as they could see. And therefore nobody was doing what God had told them to do. And that was just one of the reasons that they were able to use to dispossess Aboriginal people. Now, I'm sure if this verse didn't exist, they would have dispossessed them anyway, but Christianity was co-opted in some ways through this story. So I don't think I need to repeat that again. I think you've got that. Still, in both stories, we're very much the center of the story. Like, we are the ones that are going to look after the earth, but in a much more benign one in Genesis 2. Some of the other passages we looked at the start place humans not even in the center of the story, because the rest of creation is able to get on fine by itself with God if we would just leave it alone. Very quickly, the structure of Genesis 1, John and Elizabeth might have already done this with you, or you might have seen this before, really strongly suggests that this is poetry, not geology or evolution. The parallels between the light and the dark, and then the sun and the moon, the water above, and then the birds and the fish, the land and the animals, and then us, and then God resting. The other interesting thing is that in Genesis 2, no, let's not worry about that. Let's get on to some discussion together. So Norm Harville claims that these are two different paths, and I find that pretty persuasive, although you're very welcome to harmonize them together. I guess my observation would be that the Western Church has definitely focused on Genesis 1 almost to the exclusion of everything else, because it very neatly fits our narrative that everything's ours and we get to rule over it. Genesis 2 is a very strong critique of that passage. Norm Harville asks us to choose between them, but at the very least, I think we need to use Genesis 2 to interrogate our understanding and approach to Genesis 1. So Elizabeth, I think we might break into groups to give people the chance just to talk about those two paths and whether they see them as kind of different or complementary, and any of the other Bible passages that we've had. I can paste these questions into the chat, and I think everyone will see them still then, won't they?
Okay, they should. How long do you want to give people for this? How many questions have you got, Jason?
Look, those questions are really only if people can't think of anything to say, they can pick one. So definitely don't do all of the questions, just like pick anything that looks interesting.
Okay.
So I think you were saying 6 or 7 minutes or something. That probably
Yep.
sounds reasonable.
I'll do that. Okay, is everyone good? They know what they're doing? And you're back. It's time to speak and say what you thought in your group. So who wants to contribute something first? What did you talk about?
The hierarchy of the fishing, actually. Bruce was telling us about the fishing competition where the little bit of bait attracts the bigger fish, which attracts something else, and so on. It goes up and up and up. And isn't that what we do? We have a little bit of something, so we have to have something bigger, and then something else takes over and it has to be bigger again.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
Yes, it is.
Hmm.
Good on you, Bruce.
What else? Who else has got something they'd like to contribute? Come on, you're not normally this quiet.
We're a bit awestruck.
We spoke about kind of context, which has been a big theme in our course. So thank you, Jason, for reinforcing that, and really taken by the argument about Genesis 1, its context as being written by an oppressed, landless people. And once you begin to understand that, it actually really changes the way that you think about the text and how it's been used and different interpretations. So we had a bit about that.
Mm-hmm.
And also the difference in language, the translation of till and reap, and that what it actually originally means just casts a whole different view on the passage.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if John and Elizabeth have a kind of opinion about this, but I've read a few times people speculating that, the story in Genesis 2 goes way, way back, like possibly even to the kind of nomadic pre-agricultural part of Hebrew history, and then obviously was compiled in Babylon. But that would lend a bit more weight to the kind of serve and protect. But of course, yeah, once agriculturalists are writing and recording it, the tendency to translate it as till, because that same word is translated as both till and serve in the rest of the scriptures.
Can I just double check on that? So Genesis 2, you reckon Genesis 2 is pre-agricultural? Or it could be.
Some people suggest, yeah, there could be like an oral tradition that goes back before agriculture.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, as everyone here knows, the whole problem is that we have these documents that were written in or after the exile, recording material from before and perhaps long before the exile, and Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, Genesis 1 coming from the priests, Genesis 2 coming from the northern kingdom, and what was going on in terms of oral transmission of oral tradition in the northern kingdom around the time of the kings. How far back did it go? Way beyond that. So yeah, it's entirely possible. It can't be ruled out. Yeah. But
I always wondered why there were two Genesis accounts, but that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Well, there's two accounts, if you remember, of lots of things. There's two Exodus and crossing the Red Sea. There's two floods accounts. There's a lot of double accounts when you're looking at the Pentateuch.
Yeah. And maybe it's part of the honouring of the tradition that goes on. Even when you're arguing against the tradition, you honour the tradition by including the older version.
Okay.
Even if in our mind they're contradictory, well, perhaps in the ancient Israelite mind they're not so much contradictory as different perspectives, and we need to honour that. Honour your father and mother is one of the 10 commandments. Respect of elders is obviously a central cultural value, and so honouring the old tradition but putting alongside it a reinterpretation or another perspective, that seems to be how various things are constructed. We see the contradictions, the problems, but they saw the richness.
Yeah.
We only see contradictions because we've got this post-enlightenment hang-up
Yeah,
and
yeah.
everything's got to be a recitation of facts. And that is not the way the ancient people saw it. And if I take the Christmas story and Christmas critters like Santa Claus or Blue Peter or Black Peter or Saint Nicholas, if you look around the world, there's dozens and dozens of Christmas traditions with a different person doing different things at different times, but they all come into this central mythology that there was this saint that gave gifts. And so we somehow honour that by giving gifts, whether it's on Christmas Eve, whether it's Saint Nicholas, whether it's Santa Claus, and whether he's dressed in red or whether he's, you know, in great long robes sitting on a float. It's a similar thing, and nobody thinks twice about the fact that there's different customs that celebrate Christmas around the world.
Yeah.
That's the sort of mindset you've got to get when you're dealing with an ancient text. It's not about fact. It's about these ancient customs that have been preserved, and they weren't hung up about it, and neither should we be.
Okay.
And I think, like, we didn't touch on Genesis 3 at all, but obviously Genesis 2 and 3 go together, and, you know, I think clearly some of that story is aimed at answering questions that were important to the people who first started telling the story and still important enough to be included. Like, for example, why do human women have such painful childbirth when none of the animals in the world do? And if God is so good and created this good world, then why is it so hard? So yeah, it reads more like a story written to explain things than a story written to record exactly how things happened. And now, I guess, in another talk, I would argue that we need to move on from the explanation given for why women have painful childbirth and update.
That's why they call it labour.
That's right. It's hard work.
Yes, but it comes about from, you know, humans having large brains and small pelvises, not God punishing women for disobeying commands.
Yeah, I don't think that really comes into it, actually. I think that's probably a product of our times and our lifestyles.
Well, in part it probably is, because we've evolved in different ways.
Yeah.
And the other passages, were people kind of familiar with them? Like, it's always hard to, like, you know, I know we've all read the Psalms, but then we kind of remember particular ones and aspects of particular ones.
They ought to know something about Psalm 104. My mob should anyway. They're used to me glaring at them when they forget things, Jason.
She does a lot of glaring.
It's not so scary on Zoom, though. You're just a tiny little face.
That's right. A lot of glaring. What about Psalm 104 was important about the animals? What are they that's the same as human beings? It's a Hebrew word starting with N. Now they're thinking.
Now they think.
I only remember because you told me in the break.
That's right. They're a nephesh. They're the same as humans. They're a nephesh. They're flesh infused with the Spirit of God, and that gives them life. And when that spirit's withdrawn, they die. So animals have the same status as far as humans are concerned as being containers of the Spirit of God, and that's what animates them. So there's another word you can add to your vocabulary along with metanoia and homothumadon, nephesh. Really important word from Hebrew.
N-E-F-E-S-H?
N-E-P-H, neph-E-S-H, nephesh. Okay. When the Adam is created from the Adamah, that's the earthling from the earth, when he's created, he is nephesh. As God breathes into him, and breath and spirit are the same word, that's ruach in Hebrew. When God breathes into him, he's animated, he has life. And the same in Psalm 104. When God breathes into the animals, they have life.
Right.
So that puts them on the same footing as us.
Oh, it's all about language for sure. It's a
That's
word.
right, translation and language.
And if we don't remember, we're in trouble.
That's right, because I'm not going to all the trouble of making a sermon if none of you remember it.
I know.
Hey, so a quick question for Jason. So you talked about the ambiguity of the Old Testament. Do you find that a lot of eco-theologians, do they see it in terms of ambiguity, or do they just try to draw out kind of one main narrative, which is an eco-theological narrative? Like at the back of my mind, I read Elizabeth Johnson last year and was quite taken by her work. And I wonder if she's more rather than seeing ambiguity, but I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, look, after Lynn White's article was published, there was kind of this explosion of responses. Some just trying to outright reject what he was saying and claim that Christians had always cared about other creatures. Others that kind of really got stuck into the Bible and kind of, throwing out great swathes of it, if not all of it, and giving up on Christianity as being hopelessly human-centered and disinterested in the environment. And then a whole bunch of middle ground, which I guess was the ambiguity ground, going, some passages we can look at and go, actually, this has a strong ecological ethic. It's just that we've been reading it. Other passages like Genesis 1 that really, the language and the wording in there is really unhelpful, or gives a very negative picture of the relationship between humans and other creatures. And then would take another step and go, but what was the context that it was originally written in? So I think overall people would say that then we've assumed it is. And probably that's because Genesis 1 and 2 are very human-centered, and so they kind of set the scene for us. But then when you read those Psalms and read Job and other places, it's really putting humans in their place. But then, of course, Christianity had a really strong focus on, the value of the poor, the equality of all people, and kind of, in challenging injustice and trying to elevate and include the poor and the outcast, kind of refocused on humanity at the expense of the rest of creation, I think. Not sure that's quite answering your question, but I think, so most people that have really studied it would say, it is pretty ambiguous, but not nearly as bad as people assumed. But then by the time that gets into a sermon, usually people just pick out the good bits and leave the ambiguity out. I'm sure John Elizabeth wouldn't fall into that category, but it's because, and the sermon's not a great place to try and wrestle with ambiguity necessarily, but I read lots and lots of short reflections and short articles and sermons that would make you think the Bible is just flat out ecologically friendly. And the problem is that we haven't, the problem's with us, not with the Bible, but I think it's more ambiguous with it than that.
The trouble with acknowledging ambiguity is it weakens your argument.
That's right.
It does, but it's about accepting the Bible for what it is. It's about accepting that it's an ancient text that was written in different contexts for different people and different reasons in a different time. And if we try and make the Bible unambiguous, we're actually doing quite some violence to it, because it was never intended to be a roadmap.
Bruce, you were trying to say something, Bruce.
Yes. It seems to me that there's a lot of issues sort of around the environment. And so I was wondering, would you like to sort of define what you mean by it? Like there's organisations like PETA that are involved with cruelty. There's it's fashionable to be a vegetarian. How far is your perimeter fence around the environment and our protecting
it? That's a very good question. Look, I think so the fundamental thing for me is that this assumption that humans are the center of the story of God and life is incorrect. the scriptures kind of allude to that, at least some of them, but the new creation stories we have coming from the evolutionary sciences, for example, show that we're actually one member of the family of life. Life was here for billions of years before we came along. It'll probably be here after we've gone. And so life as Christians is about, it's almost the prodigal son story, I guess, you know, the prodigal son who demanded his share of the resources and went off and burnt through them all and then finally came to his senses. Like I see, you know, a big chunk of the Western world is doing that at the moment. We're burning through the resources. We're starting to see the consequences, and we've got the opportunity to repent and come back. In terms of the specifics of what like individual people should do, I think that's just really up to everyone in their context to work out. Within the narrative of, you know, love God, love your neighbors, you love yourself, and realizing that, you know, our actions are impacting on our neighbors all around the world these days, to take on board Jesus' warnings against wealth and greed, that, you know, do for others as you'd have them do for you. So, and all of that has ecological consequences.
Yeah.
You know, I would see that, you know, animals includes our neighbors because we affect our neighbors. So, you know, I'm not opposed to the killing of animals and eating them, but I think it's very relevant how we treat animals before we kill them. But at the same time, we live in a system that is overwhelmingly geared towards doing the more ecologically destructive thing because it's, in the short term, it's cheaper and easier, and it passes all the costs on to future generations. So to struggle against that all the time is exhausting. Yeah. So I'd rather see people doing, you know, one or two things and pushing our politicians to change the framework we live in than feeling terrible because they're not doing, you know, the 50 things that they could be doing. And I think individual responsibility is important, but where we are at the moment, the social transformation side of things is much more important. Like if I sold my car and decided just not to travel anywhere, it would have a tiny impact. But if we can get a government which is behind the electric vehicle industry, for example, instead of doing everything it can to stymie it, that's investing in renewables instead of gas, that's paying people fair wages, then that social transformation, I think, is more, the social movement is more important. But I try and do both.
Jason does practice what he preaches pretty much, unless he doesn't have an option.
But I think, you know, we need to celebrate anything that anyone does rather than getting stuck into each other over the things that we don't do. And I think, you know, that's a trap for Christianity. You know, we have fundamentalism as a big part of our tendency. You know, how many was it, 42,000 Protestant denominations or something there are, or, you know, splits there have been, something, there's more Protestant denominations than stars in the visible sky anyway. And so that tendency to go, nah, you know, you're not doing or believing this little thing that I believe, so we're going to cut each other off, I think is, we can do that with our behavior as well as we can with our belief. And fortunately, the church has been winding that back in terms of belief. So I hope we can in terms of behavior as well.
Mm.
Going to take a long time.
Yeah,
it is. And so we'll say one more thing, so I don't start rambling. That the other thing I'm very aware of is that as a, you know, Australian Westerner who's done pretty well out of the system as it is, it's also easy for me to say we don't want to get too caught up in personal change or sacrifice, because, you know, clearly when you look at the consumption curves, the only way it's coming down is if people in our kind of position massively reduce our consumption, so that people in, you know, India and Central Australia and so on can, you know, have any hope. Like the, you know, if the world lived like the average Australian, we'd need 7 planet Earths to sustain us. Like to deal with that is going to require personal sacrifice as well as systemic change.
we're not good at sacrifice.
Well, we are if we think everyone else is as well. I think that's one of the lessons we've learned. Like, in wartime, everyone planted a victory garden. What we don't like is if we get the sense that some people are shirking their responsibility and leaving it all up to us. And unfortunately, when you look at our tax system, for example, a bunch of rich people are shirking their responsibility and leaving it up to us. So it's hard to stay motivated.
And the system is designed to promote that. If you have a look at the way corporations actually promote what they're doing and how they do it and how they deliberately muddy the waters about scientific research and what's actually happening as a result. So it's like tobacco. You don't outright deny that tobacco is bad. What you do is muddy the waters and make it all dubious and ambiguous. So it could be good, it could be bad. And that's, that really draws us in and makes it harder, I think.
Almost sounds like the serpent in the garden. Like, is
It
that
is the
really
serpent in the
true?
garden.
Are cigarettes
certainly
really
is.
bad for you?
That's what they did. And if you look at early climate change documents from the fossil fuel industry, who knew very well that they were causing stuff to change, they actually wrote saying they won't deny climate change. What they do is muddy the waters, and that was their deliberate policy.
Yes.
Muddy the waters, cherry pick science, and make it look as if it was in doubt and there was indeed another side to the story, which we know there isn't. So, it's a very insidious and it's quite an evil policy.
And getting back to what Peter was saying, I think about ambiguity, that is the problem, because
that's right.
The fossil fuel industry and their political allies make a very simple story and say it emphatically over and over and over again. So yes.
Yep.
Because it works.
It does. Work with tobacco,
do you want to play
it's
that,
working with this.
Ray Minikin? Yeah. Do you want to play Ray's video, Elizabeth? And
I think John's got it.
We're doing pretty well for time. John's got it.
Can I ask everyone to mute themselves? Well, John sets it up, please.
So for the season of creation, we've been, let's just play it.
No,
there he is.
What you're getting at, for the season of creation, we've been kind of collecting sermons and reflections from different people around the United Church. And
I know it's there.
This is one that Ray did for us.
Right. Okay,
there's a slightly longer version on the web that you can find if you want, but this is kind of got some key points.
My name is Pastor Ray Minicon. I'm from the Cubby Cubby people in southeast Queensland on my father's side, and the Gurang Gurang people on my mother's side, which is around the Bundaberg area. I'm a minister here, or a pastor here with my wife at St John's Anglican Church, with the whole congregation here at St John's. We're trying a different model of ministry. And we call our ministry the Scarred Tree Ministries because on this property here at St John's there is a tree, it's an ironbark tree, that we believe has been here before or around 1788. And the old people have cut a section out of the tree for one of their utensils or uses, either as a shield or as a coolamon. And it's the only scarred tree in the Sydney CBD area, so it's very special to us and very important to us, and it's here located on St John's Church Yard. So that's why we call ourselves the Scarred Tree Ministries, but it also references also to our people who have been scarred since 1788, so it's got those kind of connotations with it. And I do a lot of work with the stolen generations who are always on the margins there and very, very scarred people. The Bible is tribal. It comes from a tribal group over there in the Middle East, and that we have this opportunity or invitation to actually look at that particular message with tribal eyes. We also know that Jesus was a tribal man. He came from the tribe of Judah. And as a tribal man, he also had totems like our people do. And so one of his totems, for example, was the Lion of Judah or the Lamb of God, or he said, I am the water of life. that appeals to us because it connects us to that kind of ways of thinking in terms of the tribal ways of thinking. Because one of my responsibilities as an Indigenous person or as an Aboriginal person is custodians of water. So water is one of my totems, as well as the koala, as well as the kookaburra. For me, that's my grandmother's totem. And in our belief systems, it's the kookaburra that usually sings the world into existence, because we're all connected to this total universe here in so many different ways. And one of those ways is through what we call our totem systems. So when we fit all that together, we live not in a disconnected world, we live in a world that is connected to each other. And so the trees and the animals and the stars and the moons and the whole landscape there, the rocks and the mountains, are all part of our family, brothers and sisters and all of that. So we identify with those particular aspects of the landscape and of all living things because of our belief systems, which we believe came from what white man calls the dreaming. The loss of all of these beautiful species that are a part of our family has been a part of our pain and a part of our suffering as Indigenous peoples. And here we live here in the Sydney Basin here. It's not only the flora and fauna that has been lost here or been transplanted or in so many different ways, but it's also the people themselves, who are the custodians of that particular knowledge. They've also been, genocide, as far as I can see here, because they don't exist here. They've all been wiped out. Indigenous theology starts in Genesis 1. Bereshit Elohim, in the beginning, God. And that's a much more better starting point, because as you go through, even in the first book of Genesis, you look at the last verse of the first chapter, and he says that everything is good, very good. All that he has created is good. It's good for all of us. We don't like the word God. We prefer the word creator, because when you go back to the beginning, you're going back to your creator, the one who made everything. And it's a better starting point for us. And then once we see that particular telescopic view of the world, we can see that everything, like Aboriginal people would say, we're all related to everything. Every life form is a part of what he created back there in the beginning. And so that's a better starting point for us. The second part of that is that we also know that we have sinned and we have, destroyed so much and of this ecosystem that our Creator has given us, freely and graciously and lovingly. And that's when you can see, in terms of the message that Jesus came to restore, it's not just to save me from my own personal sins, which is so minute in the biggest scope of things, or the bigger perception of things. He died to save the whole universe. That's not the message that we're getting from our evangelical traditions. It's all about me personally. And it excludes this whole wonderful notions of our global home, our creation, all that God has given us as a gift. And so salvation to me is, how do we then not just save ourselves, but save the blooming planet that we live in, his creation. And we can only do that if we take this invitation that he gave to Job and that he's giving to us, and let's go back to the beginning. And if we can go back into the beginning, we can possibly put things into place. That's a huge, big possibility. But the way in which I think the world is going today, this particular voice of the Indigenous peoples we know is marginalised, probably won't be heard, like our Creator's voice is never heard anyways, even in the church or in any of the other religious institutions or religions on the planet. They're listening to themselves. They're not listening to his voice, or they're not looking through his eyes. And so we've got a long way to go in order to try to convince people who they are in Christ, because Christ is the one who took us back into that beginning point and said, this is the starting point, not Genesis 3, Genesis 1. That's the starting point. If we can get back there, we might be able to save our little home, our little planet here, our land and our mother.
As Jason said, there's a longer version of it. That's an edited version that you can find online. I don't know if the Assembly's got it up, Jason.
No, it's on the Uniting Earth site.
Uniting Earth, right.
Somewhere, yeah.
What's his name, full name again?
It's Pastor Ray Minikin.
Oh, okay.
Ray used to be the secretary of the New South Wales ACT Congress.
Okay.
He's not in that role anymore, but he's still pastor at the Scar Tree Ministries in Sydney.
Okay. I'm reading a book by an Aboriginal academic called Tyson Yunka Porter.
Yeah.
And he would agree with all of that. There's a whole movement, I think, towards that kind of thinking, to like just realizing how much we have to learn from First Nations peoples, you know, from how they think. It's a classic book. At one stage, one of his Aboriginal friends says, the dreaming includes smartphones. You can't call yourself a blackfella if you haven't got a smartphone. It's a classic book.
Yeah, part of what's missing from I think the full video is about 15 minutes, and there's a bit where Ray talks about evolution, and the reason I usually cut it out is because he's quite critical, because of course he's reacting to the way evolution was used to show that white people were superior to chain of being, I should say misused. But it actually strikes me as someone who's fascinated by the evolutionary story when I read it, how similar it is to Aboriginal spirituality and kind of my understanding of some of the Pacific Island pre-missionary theology, that sense of all of life as family and connected to each other is kind of very strong in both. But I've never managed to have a chat to Ray about it, because he's so busy, which is why I keep showing his video, because to actually get him to do anything is almost impossible, because he's got so many people wanting him all the time, which happens to all of our Aboriginal leaders, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Well, it's good and it's bad. It means they get very stretched, but at least people hear them, I suppose.
Yeah.
But it does put everything in perspective, doesn't it?
It does. And it puts it, I guess, to us as sort of supreme consumers in the Western world. I don't know what the stats are for Australia. Jason might have them, but I know with the United States, it has a very small percentage of the world's population. I think it's about 5%, but it consumes something like 40 to 60% of its resources. And I would think that Australia would be somewhat similar to that. And we don't think about that. And we don't think about what that actually means if we keep living at this rate.
I was watching a program on television last night where they said that Coca-Cola has contributed something like 50% of the world's plastic pollution. When they've done collections in different countries of the plastic in the oceans, half of it's from Coke.
That would be right. And it's all pollution and no responsibility taken with Coca-Cola.
Yes.
And Coca-Cola also has a bad track record in terms of industrial rights, and it's actually shot union organisers or hired people to shoot them in the Latin American countries. I don't think it does it in the US, but in Latin American countries, it's been very much a very heavy-handed and quite violent. John and I have boycotted Coca-Cola for years and years because of a number of issues. But I mean, that's one way you can express your displeasure. If someone is contributing to plastic or doing bad things, you can boycott them and write and tell them why you're doing it.
One of the politicians in Mexico, I think, made arrangements for the school children to get free Coke rather than free milk. And he had a financial relationship with Coke in that country.
Well, that's the sort of thing I'm actually talking about. They're actually very immoral. They're not amoral, they're immoral, they're unethical. Don't drink Coke products, boycott them, people. Don't support them.
My confession and part of the ecological debt that I'm working off is that my dad actually was the marketing manager for Coke in Adelaide back when they had to use local people. So we used to get a crate of free Coke a week. And he was also team's footy coach. So the team would get Coke at halftime instead of oranges.
Oh dear.
And they'd play zinged up in the second half.
Yes, except for one poor kid whose parents wouldn't let him drink Coke, and we always felt so sorry for him.
Now he's the one feeling smug with the good, clear conscience, Jason.
He's still got teeth.
That's right.
But I mean, one thing Ray's video brings up, and this whole discussion, I think, for me is, that kind of idea of love and belief as being verbs and not just entities in themselves. So, everyone in Australia just about would say they love the environment, they love trees, forests, rivers. Just about every Christian would say they love creation, and yet the decisions that we're making as a nation are more destructive than just about any other nation on earth, and the church isn't much different. And in terms of faith, we believe that we should be caring for creation. Like, not many people would disagree with that. But then kind of the whole letter of James about, well, you can say you've got faith, but show me it in your actions. It gets trickier when we get to that stage. In Uniting, when I worked there, we struggled to do anything that wasn't cost neutral or cost beneficial. And the tricky thing is, on one hand, it makes sense, because if we invest $1 million in solar panels, or $1 million that we won't get back doing something, then that's $1 million that can't be spent on, supporting 17-year-old foster children and things. So it's, again, everybody has to move forward together, or otherwise the people doing the right thing end up paying for everybody else. But
they pay more.
Yeah, that's right.
Doing the right thing pay more because other people are not doing the right thing.
Yeah. And probably that's inevitable to some extent, always, but we're only going to get big change when everybody does it. But anyway, I started on that. Do our actions match up with our internal image of ourselves as someone who loves the environment and thinks we should care for it?
There's a difference between liking and loving. I mean, you can love the environment, but you have to like it enough to do something about it.
I'd say the other way. I'd say you can like forests, but
you have to love them to do something.
Love them to do something about it. Yeah.
True. Very true.
Which is why, I mean, a lot of.
Go on, Jason.
So I was going to say, like, a lot of kind of religious organisations that are involved in, promoting creation care or whatever you want to call it, have over the past decades really tried to focus on that, connecting people with the rest of creation, as have a number of environment groups, are kind of realizing that, like, you can tell people about a forest that's being logged, but if you take them out there for a bushwalk and give them a chance to see it and fall in love with it, and then they know that they need to act to protect it, we're kind of more inclined to, in the same way, I guess, we shed more tears over members of our own family suffering than people on the other side of the world when we see it on the news. Like, there's a kind of it's a disconnect. Sorry, Elizabeth.
That's all right. I can't even remember what it was. It can't have been important. It'll come back.
It's a Hebrew word.
It could be a Hebrew word. That's right.
Can I just thank whoever put these passages in the bonus session Ecotheology section. They're just beautifully organised under those headings. Like there's a whole lot of Bible passages that I've sort of come across, but they're just really well organised. So if you want to preach on something like humans' relationship with creation, or a great lot of, somebody's done a lot of work to organise all those passages. So thank you.
Well, we just inherited that, Peter.
Yes, I don't know who did it.
I think there's a note at the end of it. I think it's from Earth Care Resource Guide.
Yeah, it's the website at the bottom.
Yeah, bottom of page 130.
Right.
Yeah, from an organisation in the US, Chattanooga, Tennessee.
Right.
But yes, it's a great collation, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I remember what I was going to say. One of the greatest things we fear is inconvenience.
Yes.
We don't like to be inconvenienced. Like, should we do the washing up for a party rather than buy plastic plates, for instance? Should we throw our scraps in the bin rather than compost them? Do I really want to walk so many metres to put my recycling in a special bin or do certain things? We don't like inconvenience. Do I want to get the train or ride a bike or a bus rather than get in my car and drive? The Western world is living on convenience, and we really fear being inconvenienced. And if you stop and think about what is it that is your conveniences, you probably have a pretty good idea where you could start thinking about how you change what you do to have less impact, if you want some sort of measure to do it by. But I mean, 9/11 might not have happened if Americans didn't fear inconvenience quite as much, for example.
Yeah.
Another thing, Elizabeth, I think, is that as our families have got increasingly nuclear for the most part, you kind of have to do everything yourself. Like, unless you earn enough money to pay people to do a lot of things for you, like just living as a kind of lower income earner, it robs a lot of people of. So it's not just convenience; it's also kind of just staying flat out to keep ahead of the mortgage and the kids and the et cetera, especially if you're a single parent. I don't know how anyone manages to do that.
No, that's right.
Insane.
So then it becomes necessity.
Which again means, yeah, that's right. Which again means we need to transform society so that it's actually not harder to do the right thing, which is possible. It's just doesn't make as much money for
people. That's right.
Get back to more communal living, community.
Yes.
Yeah, we don't live communally. We live in, and we're all sort of shut ourselves in our four walls, unless you're Jason and live in the environment. And we don't have huge amounts of interaction as communities. And we've got to actually foster events to be communal in a way that just wouldn't have happened in the ancient world. And I should have said, when I was talking about convenience, I was not meaning the poor, Jason, because I think it's very different. But I mean, for most of us sitting here, we do things because they're convenient. We like our convenience. It's just the way it is. And we're not accountable to anyone. That's the other thing. We've been taught to think individually and about our individual rights. And a lot of things we think of as our individual rights aren't rights at all. They're just things we've gotten used to having.
Bruce, I can see you waving.
Yes, I agree with what Elizabeth has said, but I have been having chooks and ducks and growing my own vegetables for most of my married life, which is over 40 years. It's in the end, I feel it's an expensive way to do things. Like it's not convenient, it's inconvenient, and it involves work. But at the end of the day, you get the chooks going off the lane, you've got to feed them, and they're not giving you anything, and $3.50 for a carton of eggs sounds cheap. So I agree with what Elizabeth has said, but I also feel that sometimes we can, and I'm just talking about personally, a bit like Don Quixote, you know, going around, you know, slaying mythical dragons.
Yeah.
Well, that, and you know, when the pumpkins are ripening at home, they're about 50 cents a kilo in the shops because they're right there too. So.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Well, some things we do because they
accept some of what. Sorry.
Go on, Piers.
I accept some of what's being said, but I don't have chooks, but I do have a garden and I grow vegetables. Now, I get an enormous amount of satisfaction out of it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
I do too.
I get immensely satisfaction out of making compost. Now, compost is not a very exciting substance.
Hey, compost is very exciting, Piers.
I get immense excitement out of collecting leaves to make leaf mold. People look at me in astonishment when they see me filling plastic bags, and perhaps I should have used non-plastic bags to carry the leaves back to my home. But it's very satisfying at the end of the season when the leaves are rotted down and you can spread them over your vegetable garden or other parts of the garden.
Yeah. There's an inherent satisfaction in living close to nature.
Yes.
And research shows if you live close to nature, you're going to be more concerned about its preservation.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there's reasons for doing things, and some things you do are ideological. Like we put solar panels on our roof, not because we expected to get rich on the return they might generate, but you put them on because you're ideologically committed to clean energy rather than to fossil fuels.
Yes.
So, you know, when I talked about convenience, I mean driving our cars, buying things in plastic, single-use plastic, you know, getting our meat all chopped up on styrofoam trays, doing fast food in containers. It's that sort of thing that the Western world is really addicted to.
Yeah.
I think too, I'd be interested to hear your views that cost and also the complexity of sustainability sometimes makes people stall in taking things on. So a question I've had with solar panels, they're fabulous things and solar power is wonderful. And I've heard the start of a discussion as to how sustainable and recyclable are the panels we're using. And in the rollout, there's a huge push for the cheaper panels. And those panels contain a plastic layer, and that plastic layer wears out quite quickly relative to the very expensive kind. And so how is that marketed, and how does that impact what we're doing in terms of sustainable living? It can end up so complex that it creates inertia, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. Yeah. It's a tricky one. I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Did you want to answer that, Jason?
Yeah, look, I think you're definitely right, which again is, you know, part of why I see there's a very strong role for government in some of this to go, and for us to democratically make some decisions like, okay, we're not going to do solar panels with cheap plastic in them. So they're just not in the Australian market. But we live in a capitalist, deregulated society where they will be. And, you know, if you're looking at buying an electric car, you kind of know that in a couple of years they'll be cheaper. And every delay you take will probably save you some money in the long run, again, unless the government sets the policy signals to make it worth investing in the start. I mean, in New South Wales, the government subsidised solar panels and there was a massive take up and it worked really well. And I guess the thing is, not only are they not doing that, but, you know, we're massively subsidising the fossil fuel industry at the moment. So, yeah, the complexity is definitely there, and it's there in every aspect of our lives, in our healthcare and everything else. So but I think, you know, those of us who can afford to take the plunge should, because then that is what drives the prices down in a capitalist economy as well. The economies of scale. I think solar panels, I gather, are kind of under control in terms of recycling. Like, you kind of have to wait till there's enough of them to be recycled for it to become viable, but there's plans for that. The lithium batteries are the next big thing, that there are some technologies, but none of them are really viable yet. But of course, in the next 10 years, the amount of lithium batteries that are needing to be recycled will grow massively. So hopefully, you know, that'll all become worth doing. And there's already batteries that are far better than lithium out there. So yeah, I don't think there's a great answer to that. But,
No.
But yeah, if you can afford it, do it, I think. And yeah, it comes down to trust too, doesn't it? Like, we find someone we trust and they recommend someone we trust, and so we go with them. I mean, that was us with our solar people. Like, we went with people who I knew were really, really into it and had been around for 20 years rather than one that had started up, you know, in the last couple of years. But
yeah, we did the same. People who were really committed to it ideologically. And I think the other problem we find is, and this is part of this deliberate part of the fossil fuels to muddy the waters, you'll find that there's a lot of criticism of things like, but how do you recycle this? Where are you going to put that? The actual alternative to not doing solar panels is far worse, and we forget that. And the argument's put, unless we've got renewable technology absolutely bang on the money and perfect, we shouldn't do it. And that is a deliberate argument by the fossil fuel industry to muddy those waters again. So you dither and say, well, I won't invest in it. And as Jason says, if people don't invest in it, it doesn't come down in price. People don't make the effort to research how you recycle them or reuse them or make them last longer, et cetera, et cetera. So just be careful of that argument when people advance it to you, because it's often a bit of a trap. And it's just part of that confusion.
Especially since the fossil fuel industry also keeps saying, oh, we'll do some kind of carbon capture and storage thing for our emissions, but there's no technology at scale to do that either. So
there is no such thing as clean coal. If you have read that, and if you have heard someone like our treasurer talk about it, it's rubbish. That technology doesn't exist and probably will never exist. And if they even got it off the ground, it would be so expensive that it's probably not viable. But it's a lovely mythology to have around when you want to keep supporting the fossil fuel industry.
Well, there was breaking news this morning that Joe Biden has stopped the all the oil things that Trump had given.
Good.
No,
the contract.
very good.
Yeah. They've all been ripped up.
Okay.
And we need to remember that you can't infinitely pollute a planet. You can't infinitely take its resources out and trash it and expect it to sustain your life.
No.
Because it won't. You know, if you foul the water and foul the air, you are drinking and breathing that water, and it's not good for you if it's fouled. It comes down to basic survival and what's sensible. I mean, you wouldn't fill your house with carbon monoxide and think that was a good thing. Why do you want to do it to the atmosphere?
yeah, and I think that what you're just saying about Biden, you know, makes clear that although I'd hate to see us relying on politicians completely, but obviously they have a massive impact. So whether that's voting for a different party or pushing the party that you vote for to come up with policies that are going to help save the planet, I think both of those are legitimate strategies. The difference probably isn't so great in Australia between our two main parties as it was in America. But there are certainly differences, and you know, there are independents and the Greens and things that, if they have a few seats, can make things a bit more difficult. But yeah, we certainly can't wait for that.
No. Well, you've got to attack it on both levels. You've got to actually have government policy, as Jason said, to support an industry to make it cheaper. And you've got to have individuals wanting to do those things and showing that they're going to actually invest in them for the government to actually think it's worth their while.
We've gone over our allocated time, but we do that most weeks. If you got a 12 o'clock thing, Elizabeth, do we need to draw this to a close?
Yes, we do.
Well, so let's give a virtual thank you to Jason for coming all the way from
Bellingen
into our own homes without any with minimal cost to the environment. There's been some cost, of course, with Zoom, but it's been good, Jason, and you've helped us do something that this course is oriented towards doing. We've spent a lot of time in the course thinking about when particular documents might have been written, in what context, for what purpose. But all of that was for those of you that have been doing this for credit, so to speak, to resource people when they get up on Sunday or lead a Bible study, to think about how Scripture relates to us today. And we've been doing that in spades today. It's been a really good integrating way to finish the whole course. So thanks very much for leading us in that regard, Jason. We really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for the discussion.
It's fantastic.
It's been a fantastic session.
Yeah.
All the best to everyone as you take your newfound skills from this course into action. However you're doing it, whether that be keeping your minister honest when she next does her Bible study with you.
What do you mean keeping me honest? What are you talking about?
Or in your own preaching, as I know a number of you do, or in your discussing of Scripture with others. Yeah, so it's been really good course. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you all for your faithful attendance.